What's going on? They say the Russians just invaded West Germany.
This is nuclear war.
Greetings, Professor Falcon.
Welcome to a re-upload of Nuclear Nightmares. There are going to be a few of these, not because of the robot voice, although that is a factor, but mainly because some idiot had the bright idea of using copyrighted material as the theme music for Series 1. I'll keep the originals on for those who still like them, and I'll try and keep the repetition to a minimum if that's at all possible. For those of you who read the title carefully, you will know that we are going to look once again at the 1984 classic, Threads. The review that kicked off this very happy series, and it was also actually the shittest video I ever made. Apart from the other 59, of course. Now, if you've seen this film before, then you know pretty much what to expect. For those of you who haven't, spoiler alert, it doesn't end so terribly well. But be that as it certainly is, let us proceed with this review of the BBC's most effective contribution to the laxative industry. After a particularly impressive close-up of a spider's arse, and an aerial shot of Sheffield and the main title card, we get to meet our story's main characters, Ruth Beckett and Jimmy Kemp. Ruth expresses her wish to move out into the country, a view not shared by Jimmy, who retunes the radio in the middle of a news report about Iran in order to hear the football results. Ruth is not impressed, but Jimmy apologizes and all seems well. About a month later, it's clear that things have moved on significantly, both in the Middle East and in Ruth and Jimmy's lives. Ruth turns out to be pregnant, and the Soviet Union, jolly bunch that they are, have invaded Iran. Ruth and Jimmy have more pressing concerns. Jimmy's parents are more than a bit annoyed about the whole business regarding the unplanned pregnancy, but mellow out considerably when Jimmy announces that he intends to marry Ruth. Later on, whilst Jimmy is tending to his pigeons, the radio cheerfully announces that the US are going to send troops to western Iran if the Russians don't leave. It's pretty clear that Jimmy isn't too concerned. Right after this, we get an exterior shot of the steel mill where Ruth's dad works, plus one of those captions which pepper the screen throughout the film. Each one gets slightly more depressing and frequent as the movie progresses. On this occasion, it reminds us that Sheffield is the fourth largest city in the UK and is good at producing steel and chemicals. That may not sound too threatening, but this is soon followed by a caption explaining that there are NATO bases nearby. It won't be too long before we find out why that piece of information was important. In films of this type it never is. At Ruth's home, her parents are awaiting the arrival of Jimmy and his parents for a pre-wedding get-together. The TV, largely ignored by all but Ruth's dad, announces that there has been a serious incident involving a US warship in the waters off the coast of Iran. Jimmy and Ruth look over a flat and plan their new life together. Ruth expresses the view that children should have open spaces to play in. Trust me, the spaces in an increasingly urbanized island like Britain are about to be opened up quite a bit. Later on, whilst we see Jimmy's little sister trying to do her French homework, the same newscaster as before tells us that the Russians have managed to sink a US submarine and that the president is more than a teeny bit annoyed. Meet Clive Sutton, peacetime chief executive of Sheffield City Council, wartime master of all he surveys. A helpful narrator explains that in the event of a nuclear war, in which it is highly likely that central government could fail, men like Clive will suddenly be transformed into regional dictators with the full power of government. Now, if you think that's a cheery thought, we're not even warming up yet. Will 4 million degrees do? Right after this brief introduction into our potential absolute ruler, we see a news report telling us that the Americans, reluctantly, always reluctantly, have sent troops to western Iran in the hopes that the Soviets might stop being such assholes. The aforementioned Clive Sutton is seen taking delivery of a Stage 1 war preparation notice from the Home Office. But before I have too much of a go at this particular character, neither the situation nor the rules are actually his fault. It must have been murder coming home from work that evening. Nice day at the office, dear. Lovely. We finalised the logistics of where we are going to bury half of the city and how to feed the other half of it on next to bugger all. Jimmy visits his father working on his allotment. The radio is cheerfully listing the US military units sent to the Middle East in order to show Ivan the error of his ways. Jimmy's father warns him against acting like a tearaway, reminding him that he has others to think about. The conversation is cut short by the afterburners of a passing jet, on its way to RAF Fillingley. No one says it directly, but the characters seem to understand that any prospect of the crisis blowing over may be wishful thinking. In the pub, Jimmy and his friend Bob watch a news report where it would seem the Russians have moved nuclear weapons into their new base in eastern Iran. Jimmy is given to wondering why everyone is kicking up such a fuss about a place so far away. Bob expresses his desire to be intoxicated and insensible if the bomb does indeed drop, then goes on to encourage the betrothed Jimmy to chat up some women who've been eyeing them up from across the bar. Like a total bastard, he goes ahead with it. From radio reports we learn that the United States have issued the Soviet Union with an ultimatum: a joint pullout of all forces by high noon on Sunday, or else. The Soviets understand the situation completely, and respond by strengthening their forces in Eastern Europe. Or to put it another way,
go screw yourselves, Yankee bastard.
Jimmy and Ruth observe an anti-war demonstration taking place in Sheffield city centre. Apparently there are lots of these going on up and down the country. You'd be surprised how the possibility of being randomly vaporized galvanizes hitherto dormant grassroots political activity. As you can imagine, the decision by the Soviet government to say knickers to the Americans precipitates its fair share of hostility. The Americans use B-52 bombers on the Soviet base in eastern Iran. The Soviets counter with a nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missile. The Americans blast the base to buggery with a tactical nuke, and everybody stops fighting for a bit. Anyone near the Iranian city of Mashhad who thought that Sunday was going to be a day of rest can just fuck off. Ruth's parents attend their middle-class church to ask their middle-class God if he will save their middle-class asses from being irradiated by some bloody angry Russians. Amazing, isn't it? It would seem that in films like this the Russians have got piss all better to do than to go around the place starting wars for reasons which are never adequately explored. No time for mealy-mouthed pro-commie babble, though. Jimmy's dad is at the local convenience store trying to get in some supplies. Whilst he's tearing into the shopkeeper because of the prices, a lad rushes in and tells his mum and the shop in general that the Russians and the Americans have started fighting. This precipitates a mad rush for the door. A helpful radio broadcast informs us that the government has now enacted the Emergency Powers Act. This gives the still largely unprepared Clive Sutton the full power to requisition materials and properties for civil defence purposes. But don't worry, the fun doesn't stop there. The sale of petrol and use of certain roadways is restricted. People who are or may be critical of the government are rounded up by the police. Hospitals are cleared for expected casualties, and fire engines are deployed to safety. Anyone who still thinks everything is going to be alright is delusional at best. This point is illustrated when at the new flat with Jimmy and Ruth. As they are trying to redecorate, the radio starts broadcasting Protect and Survive. Ruth is overwhelmed by the burgeoning crisis and breaks down in tears. On top of all this, the Americans have blockaded Cuba again. The Russians have cut the road links to West Berlin, and just in case you were worried that the situation might be calmed down by diplomacy, the Russians have also sunk the USS Kitty Hawk. It's going to take more than a box of chocolates and an I Love Oo teddy bear to get the Americans to forget that. Over the next 10 minutes, Threads invites us to observe a nation preparing for its own destruction. Some people riot and demonstrate, others simply go through the motions. Clive Sutton and his staff take up residence in a makeshift bunker under City Hall and attempt to manage the city's emergency policy. We are told that few, if any, of the officers in the bunker will have a clear idea of what that actually is. I've never really had much time for Thursday mornings, have you? Well, if you feel the same way about that nothing part of the week as I do, then we're both in luck. There aren't going to be any more. As Jimmy's little sister goes on to deliver the newspapers, we see a group of people huddled around a television shop window, all watching Protect and Survive. I'm intrigued as to what may have been in the newspapers that morning, given that the Emergency Powers Act would have censored most of it. The stars for that day would be particularly interesting, wouldn't they?
Libra. It's going to be a bright day for you, Libra. Very bright. You might want to duck and cover because you might burn your retinas. It'll probably be a bit dusty too.
As banking is suspended and phone lines are blocked for essential communications, the city's emergency planning committee are in their bunker discussing how much food they haven't got. Then the alarm is sounded. A single warhead detonates over the North Sea, rendering communications across northern Europe inoperable. Moments later, NATO targets in the UK are hit, including the nearby RAF base. The terrified citizens look up at the growing mushroom cloud and run for their lives, apart from one woman who is unable to process what she has just seen. Some people were mean enough to find this scene amusing, but to be honest, if I had just seen that and all I did was pee myself, I'd be quite proud. As the characters frantically try to finish off their shelters or make for their basements, the second wave of the attack occurs. Sheffield does not escape the strategic salvo and large parts of the city are destroyed. Now, this movie would have been powerful enough if it had ended right there, but it goes on. Jimmy's parents are huddled under their lean-to made out of doors. His mother has received third-degree burns. We see Ruth and her parents along with her grandmother in their basement shelter. The whole shelter is rocked by a ground-burst at Crewe. In the council shelter, one of the emergency staff has been killed by falling debris. We watch these untrained civilians attempt to grapple with a problem which would be well beyond the abilities of central government to solve. Their political power is by now unlimited, but their influence has been minimized by the 100 tons of rubble and steel and shit, which has buried them. City Hall is on top of them at the moment, and it's going to take a little while to dig them all out. The services which they control by radio communications are limited. They are forced to withhold food and execute looters. Eventually, the forces on the outside are able to dig them out, but it's too late. They have all asphyxiated. We don't see Jimmy again for the rest of the film. We are left to imagine that he is being killed in the strategic attack. Instead, we follow Ruth's exploits as she struggles to survive. She sees the psychologically damaged survivors as she flees her own shelter. She also sees the physically damaged people descend upon the hospital. Sadly, the hospital is unable to help. With no resupply of drugs or bandages, and no water or electricity either, there's precious little that they can do, but they try nevertheless. Eventually, Ruth gives birth to a daughter, but not before we see her trying to cope with life in a nuclear winter. Running into Jimmy's friend Bob proves to be fortuitous, but only temporarily. Moving out of the city, the powers that be attempt to relocate her to Buxton, along with some other survivors. But the man who owns the property they are trying to shelter in eventually forces them out at gunpoint. The film tracks the next 10 years after the attack. Ruth's daughter is educationally stunted and is unable to communicate properly. I know how she feels at times. The nuclear war has damaged the ozone layer to the point where most of the sun's ultraviolet rays can get through. Ruth begins to succumb to leukemia and cataracts. She eventually dies, leaving her daughter to fend for herself. After a run-in with some youths after a botched robbery on a food centre, she too becomes pregnant. This sets up the final shot of the movie. A caption warns us of likely problems for developing children in the womb, even this long after a nuclear war. The child is mutated and stillborn. We never see the child clearly, but the final shot tells us all we need to know. The credits roll over silence. Well done on sitting through that long summary. I suppose I could have done it more quickly, though.
Got to feel for Ruth Beckett, haven't you? I mean, there she was enjoying a nice drive out with her boyfriend, only to discover that on the same day that the civil war had erupted somewhere in the Middle East, she was quite possibly pregnant, causing the planned nuptials with Jimmy to move on a bit faster than she had hoped. The Russian invasion of Iran did precious little to lighten her mood, and everyone knows she struggles with decorating anyway. I suppose it's merciful that she didn't find out what a cheating sod Jimmy was, carrying on with some bird he met at the bar whilst a tactical missile crew look on in disgust. In any case, life gets really difficult when the Russians relocate most of her hometown to the upper atmosphere. I know she was moving soon anyway, but bloody hell. The whole thing makes her morning walk a less than jolly affair, and she can't even get seen at the hospital, but at least she gets a good insight into conditions in a modern A&E department. At this point she'd had just about enough, but thankfully she gets asked out on a dinner date. Pity the lamb's a bit underdone, but if she was still feeling hungry, her afternoon of rat shopping should help a great deal. Didn't have enough time for tea and rat before her waters broke. At least the resulting child turns out to be a lot more hard-working and articulate than a modern teenager. Small comfort when you can't get the gardening done because of the bloody leukemia. She can't even be present for the birth of her one and only grandchild because of this, but on reflection that's probably a good thing.
After a drama dealing with hot issues of the day goes to air, the BBC usually man the switchboards to deal with the expected phone calls, but on the evening of September 23rd, 1984, there were none. Director Mick Jackson and writer Barry Hines concluded that they had shocked the populace into silence. People were still processing what they had just sat through. If certain sections of the internet are to be believed, I expect many of them were on the toilet. Critical acclaim of the movie was not long in coming. The movie received 5 BAFTAs the following year, and Hines received a personal letter of congratulation from Labour leader Neil Kinnock. As you may expect, the movie was championed by those on the left of politics but thoroughly lambasted by those on the right. Right-wingers were critical of the supposed Soviet readiness for a war in which they themselves would be destroyed. In my own opinion, having watched a great many of these films, I can't find one where the build-up to conflict is more authentically realised than it is here. Not just because of the events in the imagined Middle East scenario, but the way in which the characters are determined not to worry about it too much, until the events overtake them in the most brutal way you can imagine. As for the possibility of a Middle Eastern conflict leading to all-out war, during the 1980s it was seen as a legitimate possibility, and sad to say it still is, but for different reasons. The scenario played out in Threads assumes a successful Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, not an unimaginable possibility in 1984. To be certain, the Soviets did indeed begin a military build-up along the Iranian border in case the anti-Western government should get into difficulties. Such moves were carefully monitored by NATO from 1982 onwards. Had the scenario come to pass and a civil war in Iran did happen, it's likely that Soviet intervention would have been met with a robust response from the West, but in all probability, Iran would have been partitioned, rather like Germany and Korea. This does seem feasible, but it does not render the all-out war impossible either. You could argue that such a move would simply delay it for a bit. Whatever critique you care to make of the Cold War rail politics seen in Threads, there is no getting away from the fact that this film hits home in a way that films like The Day After aim for, but don't quite achieve. And the reason for this is simple. The characters we see are very down-to-earth and very ordinary. You could imagine living in the same street as either the Kemps or the Becketts. This is particularly true for British viewers. Because of this, you are not so much watching Threads as living it with the characters. This fact alone makes the film highly disturbing. The build-up to war is handled with such care that as Ruth breaks down during the flat renovation, the audience feels her anxiety. We also feel a sense of frustration, and not just in the grim second half of the picture, but during the build-up. The amount of times I found myself wishing that they would just get it all over with rather than prolong the uncertainty. All good films have the power to make you sympathise with characters, but very few induce you to feel their emotions. Carefully written, brilliantly acted, and expertly shot, Threads is a celluloid time capsule from an era where the fear of nuclear war was present in every mind which understood what that meant. It shows a culture which had not yet been introduced to the internet and still cared about each other in a way which is much reduced these days. Threads is without a doubt the finest and most powerful film of this type ever to be made. By the way, just to really cheer you up, I am posting this video on Thursday the 26th of May. Fans of this movie may realise that this is the date of the imaginary nuclear attack on the UK. No, that wasn't done on purpose. It wasn't. No. It was a complete coincidence. It really was, yeah. Cue the soothing music.